My name is James Bernett, and for 20 years I built my business the slow way. No shortcuts, no borrowed name, no rich father. Just long mornings, bad coffee, signed contracts, missed anniversaries, and a talent for staying calm when other men started lying. Bernett Logistics began in a rented office above a tire shop with one desk, one phone, and a second-hand truck that broke down twice in the same month. I kept it alive anyway. Then I made it grow. By the time I was 52, I had 40 employees, 2 warehouses, 3 regional contracts, and the kind of reputation people trusted more than paper. In my world, that mattered. Reputation fed families. I thought one day it would feed my son, too. Ethan came into the company late. Not because I kept him out, because he was never interested in earning anything while he was young. He wanted speed, easy money, clean suits, expensive watches, words like scale and expansion thrown around as if they meant wisdom. Still, he was my son. When he turned 30, I gave him a place in operations. Not power. A place. That was my first mistake. At first, he played the role well. He showed up early when I was looking. He asked smart questions in meetings. He started calling me old school with that polite little smile men use when disrespect is still testing the door. I noticed it. I notice everything. But I said nothing. A father can confuse patience with love. I did. Then he started changing things that were not his to change. He brought in outside consultants without asking me. He pushed longtime managers aside and called them outdated. He tried to move our accounts through a new holding structure I had never approved. When I stopped it, he told me I was afraid of the future. I told him the future is usually dressed like theft when it arrives too quickly. He laughed. A week later, my attorney called and asked why I was transferring controlling interest of Bernett Logistics to a family trust under Ethan's authority. I said I was doing no such thing. There was a pause on the line. Then she told me the documents had already been drafted. My forged signature was on every page. I remember sitting very still after that call. My office was quiet. The glass wall looked over the main floor, where men I had employed for years were loading schedules, checking routes, doing honest work. I looked at them and felt something cold settle into me. Not anger. Anger is noisy. This was quieter. This was understanding. My son had not been waiting to inherit my business. He had been preparing to remove me from it. That evening, I asked Ethan to come to the house. He arrived in a charcoal coat, carrying a bottle of wine he knew I wouldn't drink. He kissed my cheek like nothing had changed, like betrayal was still a private draft. We sat across from each other in the study my wife used to call the war room. She'd been dead 4 years by then. Long enough for the house to lose her warmth, not long enough for me to stop hearing her voice when I made difficult decisions. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I asked. Ethan loosened his tie. "About what?" "About the transfer papers." He didn't look surprised. That was the final insult. He only leaned back and folded his hands. "You were going to hand it to me eventually," he said. "I just moved the timeline forward." I stared at him for a long moment. At the face I had once seen sleeping in the back seat of my car after school. At the boy I had taught to shake hands properly. At the man who now thought timing was the only thing he had stolen. "No," I said quietly. "You moved against me." He held my gaze. Maybe I had to. And that was the moment I stopped thinking like a father. That was the moment I began thinking like the man who built everything. If Ethan wanted my business, he was going to learn what it had really cost. and he was going to pay in full. I did not raise my voice. Men like Ethan expect noise. It helps them believe they are still in control. Silence is harder for them. Silence leaves room for consequence. He sat across from me with one ankle resting on the opposite knee, as if we were discussing a delayed shipment or a bad quarter. Not fraud, not betrayal, not the slow murder of trust. He had my wife's eyes and none of her restraint. That used to pain me. That night it only clarified things. "You forged my name," I said. He gave a small shrug. I protected the company from hesitation. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, because it was familiar. Every thief I had ever done business with eventually reached for the same language. They called greed vision. They called disloyalty necessity. They called theft efficiency. Ethan was not inventing anything. He was only proving how little of me he had actually understood. "You think this business is slow because I am old," I said. "It is careful because I learned what fast men leave behind." He leaned forward then, finally showing some heat. "Careful? You mean stagnant. You built something good, I'll give you that. But good is not enough now. The market is changing. We need leverage, new structures, aggressive acquisitions. We need to stop acting like a family shop and start acting like a serious company." I let him finish. He needed to hear himself. Ambition likes an audience. "And you," I asked, "are the serious company? I'm the only one ready to run it." There it was. Clean. Simple. The truth always arrives stripped down. I looked past him toward the window. The garden lights were on. My wife had chosen them years ago because she said a house should never look abandoned, even in winter. I thought about the nights she waited for me while I was still at the warehouse solving problems no one else could solve. I thought about the price she paid for the empire Ethan now wanted to inherit like jewelry from a dead relative. "You've mistaken proximity for ownership," I said. His jaw tightened. "And you've mistaken control for legacy." That landed better than I expected. Not because it hurt, because it told me someone had been coaching him. Ethan did not speak with that kind of precision when emotion was involved. Someone had been feeding him language, strategy, confidence. Maybe a lawyer, maybe a banker, maybe one of the consultants he kept dragging into rooms that did not belong to them. Good. A son can be unpredictable. A conspiracy is usually ordinary. I stood and crossed to the cabinet near the fireplace. I poured myself water, nothing stronger. My hands were steady. That disappointed him too. He wanted to believe he had shocked me into weakness. Sons always overestimate the privilege of being able to wound their fathers. "When did you start?" I asked. He didn't answer. "When did you decide I was in your way?" He watched me for a moment, then said, "The day I realized you would die before you ever let go." It was such a naked sentence that even he seemed to feel its weight after it left him. The room changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. A line crossed, a door closed. I set the glass down. "Then listen carefully," I said, "because this is the last easy conversation we will have." He stood too now, defensive without admitting it. "Are you threatening me?" "No. I'm educating you." I moved back to the desk and opened the top drawer. Inside were copies of vendor agreements, internal audits, private notes, and one sealed envelope I had received 3 months earlier and kept without comment. I placed the envelope on the leather surface between us. He looked at it, then at me. "What is that?" "The first time someone warned me about you, I didn't believe them." He did not touch it. Open it." For the first time that evening, I saw uncertainty enter his face. Small, but real. He reached for the envelope slowly, as if paper could burn. Inside were printed emails, transaction records, and a photograph of Ethan leaving a restaurant with Daniel Kessler, CEO of Voss Freight, our largest competitor. His color changed. I said nothing. He scanned the pages once, then again, faster this time. "This means nothing." "It means," I said, "you are not trying to take my company for yourself." He looked up at me. "You were trying to take it for someone else." And in that moment, I saw it clearly. Not remorse, not shame, only calculation. He was no longer deciding whether to lie. He was deciding which lie could still save him. That was fine. I had already decided not to save him. He recovered quickly. That was one of the few things I could still admire in him. Not his loyalty, not his judgment, only the speed with which he could put a mask back on after being seen. "You've been watching me," Ethan said. "I've been protecting what is mine." He dropped the papers onto the desk and gave me a thin smile. "These emails don't prove anything illegal." "Neither does a loaded gun on a table," I said. "Not until someone decides to use it." His eyes hardened at that. He understood the difference between evidence and timing. I had not shown him those documents to destroy him. I had shown them to let him know destruction was available. He stepped away from the desk and adjusted his cuffs, buying himself a few seconds. It was an old habit. Even as a boy, he used movement to cover panic. When he was 12 and broke a neighbor's window, he kept smoothing his shirt while he lied to me. Back then, I almost believed him. Fathers are easy marks in small matters. It prepares sons for larger ones. "You're making this dramatic," he said. "I had meetings." "That's all?" "With Kessler?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because unlike you, I talk to people who understand scale." I nodded slowly. "And what did Daniel Kessler offer you?" He smiled again, but it came a second too late. "Nothing." That was answer enough. Voss Freight had been circling us for 5 years. Too polished to attack directly, too arrogant to walk away. They wanted our regional contracts, our warehouses, our drivers, our client list, and most of all the thing they could never build themselves: trust. Men like Kessler always try to purchase in a month what took other men 20 years to become. Usually they fail. Unless someone opens the door from inside. My son had opened the door. I sat down behind the desk, not because I was tired, but because I wanted him standing while I remained still. Posture matters. People reveal themselves when they feel examined. "You made a deal," I said. He looked at me with open defiance now. The fear was gone. In its place was something colder. Relief, perhaps. The relief that comes when pretending is no longer required. "I made a plan," he said. "Tell me." He laughed once under his breath. "You still think this is one of your meetings?" "No," I said. "I think this is your last chance to be honest." He turned toward the window, hands in his pockets. For a moment he looked like a stranger standing in my house. Then again, betrayal always makes memory unreliable. It edits the past. It stains old tenderness. It makes you question whether love was real or whether you simply mistook access for closeness. Finally, he spoke. "You built something valuable," he said, "but you built it around yourself. Every major decision, every relationship, every contract. You are the center of it. That may have worked when the company was smaller, but now it's a weakness. Investors see that. Competitors see that. I see that." I said nothing. He turned back to me. Kessler offered a merger path, quietly. If I took operational control and cleaned out the dead weight, he would back expansion, refinance debt, and move us into 3 new markets inside a year. And what would he get? Ethan's face barely shifted. Majority position after transition. There it was. The business I built with 2 hands, sold in elegant language by the son who had never once stood beside a truck in winter at 4 in the morning. Sold not under pressure, not out of desperation, out of ambition. "And you?" I asked. "Chief Executive?" The room went still, not because I was shocked anymore. Shock had already passed. This was something else. The precise shape of loss, the soundless recognition that a man can survive enemies more easily than he survives blood. "You would have handed Bernett logistics to Voss," I said. "I would have made it bigger. You would have erased my name." He met my eyes without blinking. "I would have made it matter." I almost pitied him then. Not because he was cruel, but because he was ordinary in the saddest possible way. He believed size was meaning. He believed power was proof. He believed inheritance was a form of talent. Somewhere along the line he had confused possession with creation, and no one had corrected him hard enough. That failure was partly mine. I reached for my phone, unlocked it, and pressed one button. Ethan frowned. "What are you doing?" "Closing the window." A moment later, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Then again. Then once more. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. The color left his face in stages. I had spent the last 6 days preparing for the possibility that he would choose Kessler over me. Not because I wanted to believe it, but because I have buried too many good men to call paranoia a flaw. My attorney had frozen all signature authority linked to succession documents. Our bank had been notified of attempted fraudulent restructuring. Our board, small and loyal, had received a sealed summary of unauthorized contact with a direct competitor. And 20 minutes before Ethan arrived at my house, I had sent instructions terminating his access to every internal system that mattered. He looked up at me. "You locked me out." "No," I said quietly. "I removed you." His breathing changed. Shallow now. Controlled, but not fully. "You can't do this alone." That was the first true thing he had said all night. I folded my hands on the desk. "I'm not alone." Then I watched him understand that whatever he and Kessler had planned for me was already breaking apart. And only then did I let him see a glimpse of the man he had forced me to become. He stared at the phone as if the screen had betrayed him first. Men like Ethan always believe systems are neutral until those systems stop answering to them. Then, suddenly, everything feels personal. "This is temporary," he said, though he was speaking more to himself than to me. "You don't have the structure to hold this together without me." I almost corrected him. Not because he was wrong about the strain ahead, but because he was wrong about where the structure lived. He thought it was in titles, passwords, access. He thought authority was software and signatures. He had never understood that real companies, the kind that survive recessions and funerals and broken contracts, are held together by memory. By who showed up when payroll was impossible. By who kept a promise when keeping it cost money. By who could still walk the warehouse floor and be greeted without fear. He had never built that kind of memory. He looked up from the phone. "What did you tell them?" "The truth." He laughed sharply. "Your version of it. My version built this company." His jaw tightened. "You think loyalty is enough. It isn't. Not anymore." "No," I said. "Loyalty is the minimum. That is what you never understood." He took a step toward the desk, then stopped himself. Anger was starting to strip the polish off him. I could see the boy underneath now, the selfishness, the hunger, the old resentment that had never really been about business. Business had just given it a language. "You chose them over me," he said. I let the silence sit between us for a few seconds. "No," I said at last. "You made sure there was a choice." That hit him harder than anything else I had said. Not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. Accuracy has a way of entering the body like cold air. He turned away again, pacing this time. "You always did this." "Did what?" "You make everything a test no one can pass. Nothing is ever enough for you. Not loyalty, not work, not results. You wanted obedience." I watched him carefully then. This was no longer strategy. This was confession disguised as accusation. "I gave you a position," I said. "I gave you time. I gave you room to prove you could carry weight. You gave me limits. I gave you boundaries." His face twisted with something close to contempt. "Because you knew the second I had real authority, people would follow me." I almost smiled. Not because I agreed, because I finally understood the scale of his fantasy. Ethan had not only planned to take the company, he had already written the mythology of it in his head. The son who rescued the business from the father's caution. The modern mind replacing the aging hand. He had recast theft as succession so many times he had begun to believe it. "You still don't see it," I said. "See what?" "This was never about me being afraid of losing control." He held my gaze. "It was about me waiting to see whether you could be trusted with it." That seemed to hollow him out for a second. I saw something pass through his eyes then, fast and almost hidden. Hurt, perhaps. Or the memory of wanting my respect before greed taught him to settle for leverage. Then it was gone. "Trust?" he said quietly. "You want to talk to me about trust?" Now we were getting closer. He stepped nearer, hands flat on the edge of my desk, leaning in like a man who had finally found the wound he wanted. "Mother trusted you too," he said. "How did that work out for her?" The room changed. Not visibly. The books remained on the shelves. The lights stayed warm. The clock on the far wall kept moving with the same soft, indifferent rhythm. But inside me, something old lifted its head. My wife had been dead 4 years. Cancer, that was the official truth, the acceptable one, the one polite people could carry into churches and condolence calls. But marriages leave records no doctor sees. I knew what those last 2 years had cost her. The distance, the absences, the quiet humiliations she never described directly but wore in her body all the same. I had not betrayed her in the way Ethan meant, but I had failed her in ways that still kept me awake. He saw something change in my face and mistook it for weakness. "That's right," he said softly. "You don't get to stand there and talk to me about loyalty like you were some great keeper of the family. You married the company long before you buried her." I stood. He straightened automatically. Instinct, even now. "When you want to wound a man," I said, "you should be very certain he deserves the wound you've chosen." His expression darkened, but he said nothing. "You think my failures excuse yours. They do not. You think because I was imperfect, you are entitled to be disloyal. You are not. And you think using your mother in this room will help you. It will not." For the first time that evening, he looked younger. Not innocent. Never that. Just younger. Less certain of the architecture around his anger. I walked around the desk slowly and stopped a few feet from him. "Your mother knew exactly who I was," I said, "including the things I regret. But she also knew the difference between a flawed man and a false one." He swallowed, almost imperceptibly. "And tonight," I said, "you have shown me which one you are." He tried to recover. "You don't know everything." "No," I said, "not yet." Then I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a small brass key on the desk between us. He stared at it. "What is that?" "The key to your private office at the West Warehouse." His eyes narrowed. "I had the lock changed this afternoon," I said. "Before that, I had the room photographed." He did not move. There was a safe behind the filing cabinet, not listed in company inventory. Inside it were copies of client migration drafts, projected staff reductions, a transition memo from Voss Freight, and one personal notebook in your handwriting. The color drained from his face again, slower this time. "In the notebook," I continued, "you detailed which managers would resist a takeover, which could be bought, and which would need to be discredited before the merger was announced." He said nothing. I let the silence finish the work. Then I picked up the key and closed his fingers around it. "You were planning farther ahead than I hoped," I said, "but not as far ahead as I did." And that was when I saw it. Not arrogance, not defiance, fear, real fear. Because Ethan finally understood this was no longer a family argument. It was an accounting. Fear changed him faster than anger ever could. It narrowed his face, stripped away the borrowed confidence, left him standing in my study with a brass key in his hand as if it weighed more than metal should. For the first time that night, Ethan looked like a man who had just discovered that consequences have been quietly waiting for him in another room. "You went through my office," he said. "Yes, you had no right." I almost laughed at that, but I spared him the humiliation. My warehouse, my office, my company, my son drafting its sale in secret. I held his stare. Be careful with the word right. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Not because he had accepted anything I said, because he was recalculating. Men under pressure always return to arithmetic. What is exposed? What is deniable? What can still be moved before morning? "How many people know?" he asked. There it was. Not regret, not apology, only damage assessment. "Enough," I said. His shoulders stiffened. "Who?" "My attorney, our board, 2 men in compliance, 1 banker you should never have tried to charm, and Daniel Kessler by now, I imagine, because silence travels badly when accounts begin freezing." He looked at me sharply. "You touched the financing?" I touched everything connected to my name. That landed. I saw it in the small twitch near his mouth. Ethan had spent months building confidence around signatures, structures, access points, introductions. He had mistaken the map for the territory. Now the ground beneath his feet was telling a different story. "This will hurt the company," he said. "No," I replied. "This will hurt your plan." He began pacing again, but slower now. Less performance, more instinct. The room had stopped being a stage for him. It had become a perimeter he could not find his way out of. "You think the board will stay with you after this?" he asked. "After they see how exposed we are?" I watched him carefully. "You're still thinking like a son who wanted to win an argument. I'm thinking like a man preventing a collapse." He stopped near the fireplace. "Collapse is already here." "No," I said. "Exposure is." He turned toward me with sudden bitterness. "You really love that word, don't you? Exposure. Truth. Integrity. As if you built all this with clean hands." That one I accepted without defense. Age teaches a man the difference between accusation and observation. I did not build it with clean hands, I said. I built it with disciplined ones. He gave a hollow laugh. That supposed to impress me? No, it is supposed to clarify the distance between us. Silence settled again. Not empty silence, heavy silence. The kind that asks a man whether he still intends to stand inside his own decisions once the room has stopped admiring them. Finally, Ethan said, "What do you want?" A simple question, more honest than anything else he had offered me all evening. I walked back behind the desk and sat down, deliberately, calmly. I wanted him to understand that I was no longer reacting to him. I was setting terms. "Tonight," I said, "I want you to listen." He said nothing. "Tomorrow morning you will resign from Bernett Logistics." His expression hardened at once. "No." "You will." "I have shares." "Non-controlling." "I have standing." "Not after the fraud review begins." His eyes flashed. "You wouldn't do that to me." There are moments when a man hears the last living trace of childhood in another man's voice. This was one of them. Not because Ethan sounded young, but because for 1 second he still believed being my son might shield him from the full shape of what he had chosen. I leaned forward slightly. "You forged my signature. You engaged with a direct competitor while holding internal authority. You prepared client migration drafts against the interests of your own company. You made lists of loyal employees as if they were obstacles to be removed." I let each sentence reach him cleanly. "Do not tell me what I would or would not do." He stared at me, breathing through his nose, his face pale and tight. "If I resign," he said carefully, "you bury it?" There it was. The negotiation at last. Not morality. Price. I looked at him for a long time before answering. "No," I said. Something in him dropped. "I will decide how much survives public view," I continued. "That depends on whether I find anything else before sunrise." He shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. "You've already decided to destroy me." The words hung between us, and I realized then how differently men named the same event. He called it destruction. I called it consequence. Somewhere in that gap lay the whole history of fathers and sons. "No," I said quietly. "You started that work yourself. I'm only refusing to stand in the way of it." His jaw trembled once, very slightly, then steadied. "And if I don't resign?" I reached into the drawer again and removed a second envelope, thicker than the first. He watched my hand, not the envelope. Smart enough to understand that paper had become dangerous in this house. Inside were copies of the notebook pages, a chronology prepared by counsel, and one photograph from 6 months earlier. Ethan entering a private room at the Halden Hotel with Kessler and my younger brother Robert. When he saw that last image, he stopped breathing for a second, and in that second the night opened wider. Because betrayal, if it is patient enough, is almost never carried by one pair of hands. Robert. For a moment, I said nothing. Not because I was surprised, but because surprise had finally given way to arithmetic. My brother had always been the easier man to underestimate. Softer voice, better smile, the kind of warmth people confuse with character. He had spent half his life borrowing gravity from other men's work and calling it instinct. Years ago, I learned not to trust him with money. I had not expected to learn I could not trust him with blood. Ethan looked up from the photograph, and I saw it plainly. This was the alliance he had believed would protect him. Not just Kessler's money. Family. or something close enough to imitate it. "You brought Robert into this," I said. He swallowed. "He came to me." Of course he did. Robert had been circling the edges of Bernett Logistics for years, always available with advice, always wounded by the fact that I had never let him inside the real structure of the company. He called it pride. I called it memory. I knew what happened when he touched anything that required patience. He treated loyalty like spare change. "What did he promise you?" I asked. Ethan laughed once, but there was no confidence left in it. "He said you were already halfway out, that you'd never name me properly, that if I waited for your blessing, I'd be old enough to bury you before I ever ran anything." I nodded slowly. It sounded like Robert. He had always known how to turn another man's impatience into a weapon. "And you believed him." Ethan looked at the floor, then back at me. "I believed you would never let go." "That may even be true," I said. "But it still does not explain why you chose to become a thief instead of a son." That landed harder than I intended. Or perhaps exactly as hard as it needed to. His face changed, not into remorse, not yet, but into the first shape of exhaustion, the kind that comes when ambition finally has to sit alone with itself. I stood and walked to the window. The garden lights were still burning. Beyond them, the driveway lay empty and quiet. My wife used to say that betrayal never arrives with noise. It arrives through a familiar door and sits down before you understand why the room feels cold. She was right about many things I only learned too late. Behind me, Ethan spoke more softly. "What happens now?" I kept my eyes on the glass. "Robert will be dealt with by morning." He said nothing. "Kessler will pull back by dawn," I continued. "Men like him disappear the second risk stops being elegant. The board will hold an emergency session at 9. Your resignation will be on the table before anyone says your name out loud." "And if I refuse?" I turned then. "Then the review becomes public. The evidence leaves this house, and you spend the next several years learning how expensive borrowed confidence can become." He held my gaze. "You'd send your own son into that." "No," I said quietly. "I would let him arrive there." That was the truth, and because it was the truth, neither of us tried to soften it. He sat down at last, all the fight draining out of him in one slow movement. I had never seen him look small before. Angry, yes. Arrogant, often, but not small. Now he looked like a man who had climbed onto a stage and found the audience gone. "I wanted it to matter," he said. There was no heat in his voice now, only something flat and damaged. I believed him. That was the worst part. Not that he wanted money, not that he wanted power. Those things are common and easy to understand. What made it tragic was that somewhere inside all that vanity, there had once been a boy who wanted his father to see him as worthy. Then years passed, and instead of becoming worthy, he learned how to imitate importance. "It could have," I said. He looked up at me. "This company could have been yours one day. Not because you were my son, because you had earned the right to carry it. But you were too hungry to build, so you chose to reach." His eyes lowered again. He did not argue. At last, we had reached the point where argument had no function. I moved back to the desk and took out one final sheet of paper. A resignation letter, prepared before he arrived, signed by no one. I placed it in front of him with a pen. "If there is anything left in you that still understands dignity," I said, "use it now." He stared at the page for a long time. Then he picked up the pen. The sound of it moving across paper was almost nothing. a few strokes, a name, the end of one future and the burial of another. When he finished, he set the pen down carefully, as if care still counted for something. "Was any of this salvageable?" he asked. I considered lying. Fathers are tempted by mercy even when mercy has gone undeserved, but lies were part of how we had arrived here. "Yes," I said, "until the moment you stopped seeing me as a man and started seeing me only as an obstacle." He closed his eyes once, briefly, then rose from the chair. At the door he stopped, one hand on the frame, not turning around. "Did you ever love me more than the business?" The question should have wounded me. Instead, it revealed the last distance between us. He still thought love was measured by what a man was willing to surrender. He did not understand that sometimes love takes its final form as refusal. "I loved you enough," I said, "to spend 20 years building something you could have inherited with honor." He stood there a moment longer, then nodded once and left. I listened to his footsteps fade through the hall, then to the front door opening, then closing. After that, the house became very still. I sat alone in the study my wife had once called the war room and looked at the signed letter on my desk. I expected triumph. Men tell themselves that revenge will feel clean if the betrayal was deep enough. They are wrong. There was no triumph in it. Only precision. Only cost. Only the cold relief of having cut rot out before it reached the foundation. By midnight, Robert's access to every family account had been frozen. By 1, Kessler's office had sent a statement denying any active transaction with Bernett Logistics. By morning, my board stood behind me. Not because I was blameless, but because I was still the only man in the room who understood the difference between building a company and trying to seize one. Ethan's name came off the door before noon. I kept the brass key. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. People think betrayal breaks a family in the moment it is discovered. It does not. It breaks much earlier, in smaller permissions, in little surrenders of truth, in the long seasons when ambition is mistaken for strength, and silence is mistaken for peace. By the time I understood that, there was nothing left to save except the work. So I saved that. The business survived. My son did not leave in handcuffs or disgrace splashed across headlines. I gave him the one mercy I still controlled: privacy. Not because he deserved it, but because his mother once loved him, and some debts remain even after the dead are gone. I have not seen him since. Sometimes, late in the evening, I stand alone in my office above the warehouse floor and watch the men below moving with the same honest rhythm that built this place from the ground up. Engines, papers, voices, light on concrete. Order, continuity, the ordinary machinery of trust. My name is James Bernett. I built my business over 20 years, and in the end, I learned that the hardest thing to protect was never the company. It was the part of myself that remained human after I did.